My stepdaughter threw away my late mother's quilts, so I revoked her down payment. For decades, I let my kindness be their safety net. I paid tuition, fixed cars, kept keys in my purse because I believed family first. That faith became my weakness the day Camille called the quilts cluttered garbage and smiled like she'd done me a favor. My name is Loretta Jenkins, and I am 62 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own entitlement, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe it's time for us to stop carrying everyone else and start protecting our peace. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to I remember the quilts first because my mother kept them folded on top of the cedar chest like a quiet promise. Each stitch had a name. My grandmother's care in a blue square, my mother's careful, crooked daisies that no one else could sew the way she did. When my husband James married me, Camille was still in college, and I told myself I would be generous. I rose at 4 in the morning for church breakfasts, bent over saucepans at noon for Sunday dinners, and never, not once, let anyone go hungry. Camille ate at this table like she belonged, so I believed she did. Promises became habits. I drove Camille to interviews when her car fell apart, paid the deductible when her phone cracked, and quietly covered an odd expense slip her boyfriend left behind. There were nights I sat up balancing my own bills while drafting checks for hers, convincing myself that family meant sacrifice. The neighborhood knew me by my pies and casseroles. Church ladies would tap my shoulder and say, "Girl, you do too much," and I'd smile and keep going. That smile hid an account with withdrawals made in silence. A year before the house thing started, I told Camille I would help with a down payment, $50,000 to be exact, if she found something in the historic district she liked. I said it casually, over sweet tea, after she showed me a listing on her phone, like we were planning a garden. She hugged me, told me she loved me, and said she'd make me proud. I pictured her in rooms with tall windows, the same way I'd pictured my own children in cap and gowns. Saying yes was easy. I believed my yes was unconditional. A few months later, I picked up extra shifts at the clinic because James's knee surgery hit our savings. I didn't tell Camille I was tightening my belt. She called for help when her credit card maxed out after a weekend. I covered it. She texted, "Mama, I'll send it back next month," and I believed her. I folded laundry while counting the ways to keep everything afloat. When the realtor started talking dates, escrow, earnest money, I felt both proud and nervous. The world had a way of balancing on small bills and promises. My checking account carried the ghosts of all the favors I'd done, but it also carried, in some quiet corner, the intention to help one girl I've loved enough to call my own. The first little fissure appeared when Camille started talking differently. Gratitude turned into expectation, without me noticing. Help arrived as an entitlement on her face. She'd show up late to dinner and shrug. She forgot to call when she hit a pothole and expected me to pick up the pieces. Once at a family reunion, she rolled her eyes when Aunt Bernice asked after my health and later told me I should stop dramatizing small stuff. The next week, I paid half the landscaping bill for her garden apartment because the landlord threatened eviction. Little by little, she took the space I used to occupy as comfort and made it default. And still, I kept saying yes. That Saturday before the attic cleaning, I sat on the front steps and watched sun cut slats through the oaks. James was napping in his chair with a cushion under his knee. Camille was supposed to come by and help with boxes. I gave her that weekend because that's what you do. I had no idea I was handing her the very thing she planned to throw away. Before I could fold the last of the church blankets, I heard her humming in the attic. She'd always had a knack for organizing, clinical, efficient, a different kind of love. She texted, "Come up and look, clearing this place out so we can update the storage." I could hear the careless joy in her voice. I walked upstairs with a tray of lemon bars, believing I was about to watch order be restored. Instead, I found war on my porch, boxes gaping, quilts thrown over the railing. Camille was bent over the cedar chest with an expression I didn't recognize, light, untroubled, free of the ache that stitches carry. I asked her to be careful with my mother's things. She laughed, a sound that did not belong to a woman handling heritage. "I'm getting rid of this clutter, Loretta," she said. "These quilts are just old rags. Nobody wants them. They'll only take up space." That was the first real cut. An ordinary sentence with a blade. I watched her, hands poised like she had authority over grief, and tried to gather myself into a question. Instead, I heard, "Relax, Mama, I'm doing you a favor. Sell them for scrap, you'll see," as she shoved the first folded square toward the open window. My heart went small in my chest then, like a bird caught in a cage. I didn't shout. I didn't scream. I went downstairs, made tea, and folded it with the quietness of habit. I let the lemon bar tray sit untouched. People might have called me foolish for not tearing her apart in that moment, but I'd been schooled in restraint. I had believed that calm kept the household whole. I had been wrong. When I stormed up the stairs the next time, it was too late. Camille was laughing on the porch, cigarette in hand. Yes, she smoked now, a fact she'd hidden before marriage, and 3 quilts lay like wet laundry in the back of her car. I asked what she was doing, and she said, without hesitation, "Clearing out your attic, Loretta. You never use these things. They're clutter." She said the word as if it absolved her. I followed her to the alley behind our duplex because I couldn't stand the idea of the quilts in the garbage. I watched her toss them into the city dumpster with a careless snap of her wrist, as if she were discarding old plates. The lid slammed with the same finality as a verdict. I knelt there, hands steady, and pulled them back out one by one like they'd be unmade stitches. The 3rd quilt had my grandmother's sunflower pattern, the thread dulled by decades, but alive with names I could still hum. Camille stood across from me, chest out, telling me I was making a scene, over-dramatic, and that I should let things go. When she said, "Lord, Mama, why you keep all this junk? It's holding you back," it felt like someone had reached inside my rib cage and rearranged my insides. She treated those quilts like upholstery, not like prayers. Her tone made me aware of how many favors had been cataloged in her mind as transactions she could check off and forget. The theft wasn't monetary, it was moral. She had taken from me a lineage I'd promised to guard. That afternoon, she invited a friend, Jade, for coffee and said, "Loretta's always been sweet, but she'll do anything if you ask her. She'll just handle it." Jade laughed, and the laugh was a kind of consent that stung more than any accusing finger. They made plans, they clinked mugs, they omitted the fact that the quilts had almost been lost under the dump lids. Their conversation slid around my presence the way a blade slides around bone. Camille assumed I'll patch the hole she made in my history. She assumed I would prey on it and forget. The gaslighting began in small, strategic ways. When I asked why she did it, she answered with broader offenses. "You always hold on to things," as if responsibility for my family's history was a burden I chose alone. When I reminded her of the weddings, the graduations, the times I'd co-signed loans, she shrugged and said, "You did it because you wanted to. Don't act like you're doing me a favor." She was erasing decades of unpaid kindness in under a sentence. Later that night, she called while I was washing dishes and said, "You gotta stop being so dramatic. You'll see. Housing is complicated. I needed that attic space. Quit acting like you're the queen of nothing." Her arrogance swelled into entitlement. A week after she tossed the quilts, she brought up the down payment again in front of James, as casual as ordering takeout. "Loretta promised me the $50,000, right? You said you'd help." Her eyes were steady, expecting validation. James blinked and looked at me, and I could see the discomfort on his face. He'd been raised to quiet family storms, not stoke them. I told them both, calmly, that I'd said I'd see what I could do. Camille leaned forward and said, "That's what I'm talking about. You always say that." It was a jab that landed precisely where it was meant to. The real cruelty was never a raised voice. It was the way she treated my kindness like rent. She began to schedule my help as if I were an employee. She'd text, "Can you pick up my kids?" Or, "Can you pay this bill now? I'll send it back." And when I didn't answer immediately, she called me slow or too old-fashioned. One evening, James admitted his knee was acting up and asked if I'd reconsider the money timeline. Camille rolled her eyes so loud even the neighbor's dog barked. "You won't have it when you need it," she said. People need houses now. She spoke like every calendar on her phone had a deadline, and her deadlines mattered more than our history. The final push came with a slyness that belonged to someone used to getting their way. She scheduled the closing date without discussing details with me, then dropped the news like a dessert plate. "Closing's next Friday," she said. "Earnest money's down. I'm good." Her voice hummed with certainty. I could see the realtor's emails in my own inbox later that night, attachments labeled "Final Loan Approval" and "Closing Instructions." She'd assumed my promise covered everything, as if my life savings were a line item in her budget and not the remainder of a marriage built on 2 paychecks and careful thrift. That evening I found her on the phone, louder now, bragging to someone about renovations she'd dreamed up. She said, "Loretta's putting up the down payment. She wants to help. Aunt Loretta always does." And she added, as if it were decisive, "She don't even understand what this neighborhood means to people like me." I realized then that gratitude had been replaced by ownership. She believed she had a deed to my generosity before anything was signed. The chest I kept my mother's quilts in might as well have had the words "property" painted on it. Something in me cracked then, quietly, not theatrically. I folded myself into a decision as one folds a fragile blanket, careful, deliberate, final. I told myself I would not be the person who kept everyone afloat at the cost of my home, my sleep, my quiet life. I could see the shape of a different morning, one where my own needs came first. That night I slept with the quilts around my shoulders like armor and made the first move toward an action that would change everything. I woke before dawn with the quilts pressed to my chest. Dawn had a way of making hard decisions seem less like punishments and more like truth. I sat on the edge of the bed, the fabric heavy and familiar, and flipped through old photographs that had fallen out from between quilt folds, wedding photos, James holding Camille when she was small, my mother smiling on a front porch that I still remembered. I traced the thread with my fingertips. Each tug in the stitching was a story my hands had learned to read. The next morning, instead of calling Camille, I drove to the bank. I didn't announce it on social media. I packed 2 quilts in the car, one with sunflowers, the other with my mother's crooked daisies, and drove past the bakery where the owners waved. On the way, I replayed the past weeks like a tape in my head, the laughter on the porch, the dumpster slam, the way Camille's voice carried entitlement like a flag. At the bank, the teller recognized me and offered condolences for James's knee surgery again, but I wasn't there for pleasantries. I sat, quiet and steady, and told the new manager that I needed to cancel the pending wire transfer for a $50,000 gift. Her eyebrows arched. "Is this for an escrow?" she asked. I nodded. There was a formal pause, paperwork, authentication, the slow bureaucracy that acts like a second set of hands. I signed forms with a deliberate pen. It surprised me how calm my signature looked. No flourish, just a flat line of ink that severed an expectation. The bank asked for a reason. I told them it was a private family matter and that the funds should be returned to my account. They processed the cancellation. The manager mentioned that because the wire hadn't cleared yet, the money would be back in 2 business days. I breathed a little and let the moment settle. It felt like closing a door on a noisy hallway. Leaving the bank, I drove by the alley where I'd rescued the quilts. The driver of the sanitation truck gave me a nod, and I nodded back. Small gestures matter. I put a note in the cedar chest. "Do not touch." It was not dramatic, no televised confrontation, no raised voice, just a clear line drawn in fabric and ink. That afternoon, when Camille messaged me a simple, "Hey, where the check at?" I didn't respond. She called the house and left a message. Her tone was empty, like she'd pressed buttons on a vending machine and nothing came out. When she finally knocked on my door that evening, she arrived with a realtor in tow and a calmness that assumed a closed loop. The house would be hers on Friday. I admitted them in and sat at the kitchen table folding quilts. She reached for a mug like she belonged here. The realtor kept glancing at the quilts, and when she finally broke the silence, she said, "Oh, are those the historic family quilts? Those are beautiful." Camille smiled as if the compliment belonged to her. I didn't look up. "I canceled the wire," I said simply. Her smile faltered like a light being turned off. The command of entitlement slipped off her face, and something like panic hovered in its place. "What do you mean?" she asked. Her voice had lost its bluntness and acquired a pleading edge it had never worn with dignity. "I mean the funds are not going to be wired," I said. "I won't be handling your down payment." The realtor shifted, the professional mask tightening. "Mrs. Jenkins," she said carefully, "we had everything ready. We can push the closing." "No," I interrupted, softer than the word might suggest. "The earnest money is non-refundable if the buyer can't close. That's out of my hands." Camille's face betrayed her in a way words couldn't fix. She asked why, as if there could be a negotiation on a moral stance. I explained, steady as a metronome, that she had thrown away something precious without care, that she had treated my family history like junk. I didn't lash out. I didn't catalog every favor. I didn't have to. The facts existed between us like a ledger. I could have lectured, could have called her every harsh name I'd learned in nights of anger. Instead, I closed the ledger with a line: "I will not enable you anymore." That night, in bed, James asked if I'd done the right thing. He worried about the fallout, about hard feelings, about the way families fracture. I said I didn't know. I only knew I had kept my mother's hands in my lap and refused to let them be treated like disposable fabric. When I told him how Camille had laughed with Jade about my dramatic ways, his face hardened in a manner that made me believe I was not alone in my boundary. The next day, something else happened. Camille texted me a picture of the cedar chest emptied, its felt lining bare. "Look," she wrote, "I put the old things in storage. Better for you." The ellipsis at the end was a jab. I stared at the message and then at the quilts folded across the chair in the sun. I replied with 2 words: "Keep your things." It was not cruelty, it was finality. By the end of the week, the bank confirmed the funds were back. I sat on the porch that evening, wrapped in my mother's quilt, feeling winter leave my shoulders like a small body of water disengaging. I had taken a stand in a way that was true to who I was: quiet, dignified, immovable. The choice was not kind in the soft way people expect kindness to look. It was kind to myself. Life without my safety net didn't explode into fireworks. It unraveled in ordinary, devastating ways. Camille called the realtor, who called back hours later with the calm of someone who'd seen too many deals fall apart. "Loretta," the realtor said, "the escrow won't close without that wire. The seller's holding the deposit." Camille's voice cracked into a sound I had heard when she was a child and scraped her knee. She asked for me to fix it, the language of someone who expected miracles on command. A twist appeared I had not anticipated. The lender pulled Camille's pre-approval after a cursory audit. In their reevaluation, they found inconsistencies, employment gaps she hadn't disclosed, and deposits on her account that looked like third-party transfers. It wasn't illegal necessarily, but it raised flags. The broker called in a report and then an apology that sounded thin over a speakerphone. Suddenly, the earnest money was imperiled not only by my decision, but by a paper trail that revealed she had been counting on my pledge more than it appeared on the balance sheet. Camille sat on the couch, phone pressed to her ear, and I watched dignity evaporate from her posture. Her landlord called next, irritated because Camille had missed a rent payment while shuttling funds around her accounts. Her girlfriend, Ola, texted, "Girl, are you okay?" as if that mattered more than the forfeited deposit. Her niece's preschool teacher called to say that Camille had missed picking up baby Malik last Wednesday, again. And the family began to whisper that perhaps their darling had been leaning on favors too long. The social stitches that had held her life together started to fray. I did not celebrate. I made tea. On the 3rd day, there was a humbling moment that felt like salt. Camille's boyfriend, Marcus, who had been planning a career move, texted that he couldn't handle the instability and needed some space. "I'm tired of cleaning up money messes," he wrote. And then, "This house thing was supposed to be for us." The us dissolved. That was a consequence that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a life built on assumptions. Word spread in small, efficient ways. A neighbor from down the street knocked and asked, "Did you hear?" She didn't need to finish the sentence. In the church parking lot, a woman whose son had been helped by Camille rolled her eyes and said, "Girl, I thought she had it together." The choir director avoided meeting my gaze. Pride and humiliation met like 2 old acquaintances and nodded at each other. Her reputation snagged on the truth. Then came a legal notice, an addendum from the seller's attorney, informing the buyers that the earnest money would be retained under the purchase agreement because the buyer failed to perform. Camille read it aloud in my kitchen, the paper crinkling in her hands like dry leaves. "You did this," she said, meaning me. She looked for an accusation that would hurt and found one readily. Me. She wanted to name me the villain. I let her say it. But here's the twist that dethroned any simple villain narrative. The seller, it turned out, had ties to people in Camille's social circle, friends she had used to charm her way into favors. News leaked that the seller was considering a second contract because the house had been relisted. Camille read an online forum where someone called her a taker and shared a video of her hauling quilts to the dumpster. Someone had filmed her without thinking of consequences. When the video spread to a few community groups, the shame multiplied, and a job that had been tenuous suddenly became at risk because clients whispered and relationships cooled. While all that swirled, I stayed quiet. I received phone calls from family, some trying to mediate, some pretending neutrality. James's sister called, and we spoke in low voices about the danger of enabling. A cousin I hadn't heard from in years apologized for the way Camille had called my kindness weakness. "We all get so used to what people will do for us," she said. That conversation was a kind of mirror. It didn't make up for the quilts, but it reflected the truth of my choice back to me. One evening, Camille showed up at my door with mascara streaking her face and a pleading tone that made her sound younger than her years. "Mama, you don't understand," she said. "If I lose this deposit, I'm done. I need that house. Please, I can make it up." Her breath came quick. The desperation smelled like defeat. I handed her a cup of tea and watched her hold it like someone trying to warm a cold hand. I could see in the tremor of her fingers how the world had been cushioned by favors, and how, without them, gravity showed up. I thought briefly about offering help of a different kind, connecting her with community resources, recommending a credit counselor. But she wasn't asking for that. She was asking for a bailout. The moment had come when consequences were doing their work, and my involvement would have interrupted natural outcomes. I didn't enjoy watching someone fall. I also didn't enjoy watching someone continue to believe they could act without cost. The house was ultimately sold to another buyer who had saved, who had been ignored in silence until opportunity knocked. Camille watched the sold sign go up from the back of a car, hands clutched into small fists. That final image, her silhouette against the sign, small and defeated, felt like the closing of a chapter and revealed, finally, that my choice had shifted the axis of her life. It hurt to see. But watch I did, because I had stopped being the person who stitched everyone's life back together at the cost of my peace. They came back, of course. The crawling is almost always the same choreography. Calls at dawn, messages at midnight, half apologetic entreaties at church potlucks. Camille started with tearful texts. "I messed up. Can we talk?" And when that did not work, she appeared at my gate with jasmine stems in her hand like a peace offering. She'd lost her place at the top of the pile and wanted back in. The first time she knocked, I was pruning the azaleas in the front garden, the sun low and gentle. The scent of dirt grounded me. I answered the door with my hands still dusty and the quilts folded over the armchair behind me. Camille's hair was frizzed at the edges from stress. She said, "Mama, I need you," like a prayer. I felt something soft and old unspool briefly at that sound, a tenderness I'd been born with. But tenderness is not the same as submission. "Bless your heart," I said, and the phrase landed with weight. It was not a dismissal in cruelty. It was a line with lace. "But I'm done." She opened her mouth to argue, to offer an explanation, to promise that she'd change. I listened the way you watch a neighbor rearrange lawn chairs, tolerant but unmoved. "I can't be your bank anymore," I told her, folded my hands and added, "If you want help finding counseling or a budget coach, I can do that. I won't be writing checks." Her pleas grew shrill for a moment, then collapsed into a long, ragged apology that was more about her relief than mine. "I'll pay you back," she said, as if that could patch the way she'd tossed my mother's hands into a trash bin. I told her not to pay me back. I had never made a ledger out of love. I told her instead to pay back the trust she'd broken by showing up, being punctual, owning mistakes, and by keeping a job once she had it. She left with a sigh that sounded like someone stepping out of a too small dress. Neighbors watched and then returned to their roses. James called that evening and said he feared the rupture would never heal. I told him I didn't want to hurt her. I wanted her to grow. He said that sounded like me. The truth was, I wanted life that breathed, quiet mornings, the sound of rain on the roof, the way the quilts smelled like my mother stirring dinner. I wanted to be soft with myself for once. Healing arrived not as a sudden epiphany, but as ordinary moments stitched together. I started going to the early church service again, not to be asked to sing in the choir, but because the stillness around the organ calmed the frantic part of me. I began to plant collard greens in the back bed, turning the soil slowly, as if patience was a muscle that needed working. My neighbor, Miss Ruby, brought over a jar of peach preserves and sat with me on the back steps, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. We talked about nothing important, a recipe, a nephew's graduation, until the quiet between words felt like relief. Camille circled the house like an animal unsure of forgiveness. She sent gifts, cheap things from online stores, wrapped without thought. I returned them without comment. She asked friends to mediate, to say a kind word, and some did, but kindness without consequence was a river that soon ran dry. I offered no public spectacle. I refused the role of martyr and refused the role of judge. I let time do the parts I had once tried to fix with checks. One morning, I woke and decided to repaint the guest room. I cleared out dust and tape, and when I opened the cedar chest to move the quilts, I held them up in the sunlight. The stitches glowed like old constellations. I smoothed them over my knees, and their weight was a comfort, not a burden. I drank my coffee slowly and listened to the neighborhood wake up. A child down the street called for his mother. A bus hissed. Life continued in small, ordinary beats. The last time Camille knocked, months later, she looked smaller. Her voice was steady, but without pleading. "I wanted to let you know I'm getting help," she said. "Therapy. I'm working. I just wanted you to hear it from me." I nodded and set a cup of tea in front of her. There was a softness in the way she sat that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with consequence. "Good," I said simply. "Keep it up." When she left, I walked to the porch with the quilts over my shoulders. The sun warmed the fabric. The threads hummed with names. I sat down and smoothed one quilt over my knees. I watched the street from my chair, the same way I'd watched people come and go for 30 years. I felt a peace that wasn't loud. It was the kind of quiet you only earn after you've refused to be a doormat. The quilt smelled faintly of lemon bars and church basements and my mother's hair oil. I tucked my feet under me and folded my hands on top of the fabric. A blue jay landed on the cedar fence and hopped, deciding between a leftover sunflower seed and the morning. I reached out a hand and settled it on the quilt near my knee. The stitches lifted under my palm like a heart beating in slow motion. It was ordinary, steady, utterly mine.